So welcome everyone. Welcome to our Martini happy hour with the fabulous John Martini. For those of you who are new to this call or new to the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild, my name is Helen Hickman. I'm presently the president of the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild. And I'd like to introduce Len Holmes, who is our webmaster and my partner in crime here, navigating the call. Again, for those who are just jumping on, please put your name in and where you're from. We're happy to have you here. Again, for those who are just jumping on, please put your name in and where you're from. We're happy to have you here. For those of you who are not familiar, the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild is a guild here of about 200 members in the Bay Area. It's tour specialists and tour operators here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Great, so welcome. We really appreciate you having here. If you could mute yourself while you're on the call, that's great. If you have any questions for John Martini while we're on this, please put them in the chat. You can do it to either everyone or myself. That's the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild, the SFTGG in the chat, and I would be more than happy to field them, and John will have plenty of time to answer in the end. I would love to introduce John Martini. John Martini is a fellow member of the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild. He is what I like to call the rock star of history here in the Bay Area. He has been, this is his third talk with us doing these presentations. He's a San Francisco native. Yes, they actually do exist. And he's been a lover of history of California and the American West in the Bay Area for many years. He's also a National Park Service ranger for over 25 years, park ranger for over 25 years, and was in the Presidio, Fort Point, and Alcatraz. He's written many books, an author of San Francisco and Bay Area history and also military history, and has been known to be on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, PBS. So we are thrilled to have him here again, and he's going to be talking about one of our great celebrations here in the Bay Area, the 1894 World's Fair in San Francisco. So John, are you ready?
I'm here, Helen.
Okay, great. I am going to send this over to you. Hold on, let me.
Well, hi, I'm John Martini. This is very odd for me because for 25 years as a park ranger doing tours, I used to looking at sea of faces and watching people either smile or frown to give me an idea how I'm doing. So I'm kind of flying in the blind here, but I'll watch you, Helen. I can see your face pretty good.
All right.
So what I want to talk about is San Francisco's Forgotten World's Fair. I grew up in the city. My mom took me to Golden Gate Park all the time. And when we'd go to the DeYoung Museum, one of our haunts, she'd always mention that, oh yeah, there was a big World's Fair here once. And this was in the 1950s. And the idea of a World's Fair in the 1950s was, oh gosh, there'd been the big ones in New York and San Francisco. There'd been the World's Fair in Brussels. I had a hard time envisioning how could there have been a World's Fair in Golden Gate Park. San Francisco has had 3 World's Fairs. Probably the best known one to people, ironically, is the one that landed in the middle. This is a photo of the 1915 World's Fair. Took place in what's now the Marina in 1915. Ran for just about 11 months. It was followed by the 1939 World's Fair on Treasure Island called the Golden Gate International Exposition. That one ran for 2 years. The one that we're going to be focusing on is the granddaddy. Actually, it was the smallest and the shortest lived. But it was called the California Midwinter International Exposition. And that's a mouthful, and everybody just called it the Midwinter Fair. Little, it was only covered a few dozen acres in the heart of Golden Gate Park, and it ran remarkably short. It ran from January 27th, 1894, up until the 4th of July, 1894. The idea of calling it the Midwinter Fair kind of gives you an idea of why it was held here and why it was held starting in January. California was a young state we were still the Wild West in 1894, as far as the rest of the country knew. And holding a World's Fair did two things. First, it let people know that California has come of age. It can host a World's Fair, it can draw people from all over the world. And secondly, we got the climate, whereas the rest of the country is freezing and chattering their teeth in January. We're going to hold a fair that's going to draw thousands and thousands of people every day. It's a celebration of California's climate. An earlier version of the reason the Rose Bowl is played on New Year's Day in Pasadena, show off California's salubrious climate. And this is the guy who really came up with the idea of the Midwinter Fair. Charles DeYoung, or M.H. Michael DeYoung. Michael DeYoung and his brother Charles were huge in the history of San Francisco. Michael ran the San Francisco Chronicle, still publishing today, and he was a huge booster of California, booster of San Francisco, and he was a capitalist. And the year before the Midwinter Fair, in 1893, he was a commissioner on the what was called the 1893 Columbian Exposition that took place in Chicago. This is the famous White City Fair. It celebrated the Columbus's discovery, quote, bumping into the New World. And it didn't take DeYoung more than a couple of weeks watching the fair and what it did to realize we need something like this in California. DeYoung decided that he would gather a group of people together, a group of private investors, and they would have a, let's call it a mini version of the Columbian Exposition, and they'd hold it in San Francisco, and they'd hold it the following year. In fact, the fair in San Francisco was going to be a scaled down and heavily recycled version of this Chicago fair. And it's astounding in this day and age that they were able to pull a fair together this fast. We think of doing major projects like, I don't know, building an extension to a freeway or BART and years of environmental planning and money, right? No, this one from the first meeting in 1893 of the planners for the San Francisco Fair, it was only 6 months till the fair opened. And DeYoung raised private capital to make this happen. DeYoung, the other people on the board he pulled together, they lobbied San Francisco and the state of California to carve out a hunk of then brand new Golden Gate Park and turn it into the site for which they called the Midwinter Fair. DeYoung is charging around. He's raising money. He's arranging for exhibits to be brought west. He raised $344,000 in 1890s dollars. You measure that today, dollar in those days equals about $30 today. So DeYoung is raising like $10 million to put this fair together. In this bird's eye view of Golden Gate Park, if you look in the center right, that's where the fair was going to be built. It was a relatively undeveloped area. Trees had been planted, and there was a vision of turning it into a giant music valley, a music concourse. And the planner for Golden Gate Park, or his actual title was the chief gardener, John McLaren, all of a sudden is told in no uncertain terms, you're going to host a World's Fair. And McLaren was livid, and but he took his marching orders. Things again were happening remarkably fast. The first meeting for a Midwinter Fair was May 31st, 1893. The plan was approved less than a month later to actually build this thing. Imagine the planning processes that we have to go through now. 1 month to build a World's Fair with 120 buildings. It's going to cover the heart of what's today the music concourse. So that helps you get an idea of its location. Later on, we'll go and we'll look at some trace remains of the fair that still exists. But up there where it says the Grand Court, that's today's music concourse. And it was surrounded on several sides by major buildings that were exhibit halls, by smaller exhibitions that were county exhibits, that were state exhibits. You had commercial activities, you had a midway, you had rides, you had wild animal shows. It was everything that a World's Fair expected to have, except squished down into this small area in Golden Gate Park. First thing they did was they had a groundbreaking ceremony, and that took place on August 24th, 1893. I love this photograph because it's so typical of the weather out there in the Richmond district in summer. You've got that miserable, never-ending overcast. Here you have a huge throng of people. Somewhere in the middle of that, according to the caption, is M.H.D. Young, the Director General of the fair. He's raised money. He's gotten the permit processes through. Now he's the director. And thousands of people, they gather in the fair for the turning of the first shovelful of earth. And you talk about fast track. After the speeches are over, the band's played, over the hill come the horse teams with scrapers and men with shovels. And they're singing God Bless America because there's a fair to be built. And in double time, the center of Golden Gate Park is turned into what was nicknamed Sunset City. Buildings were put up at an astonishing rate. And like most World's Fairs, most of the buildings were of real simple wood and lath construction, not meant to last. This is a rear view of the only permanent building that was constructed for the fair. And this is a building that was called the Fine Arts Museum, or sometimes it was called the Palace of Fine Arts, because it's where they were going to exhibit paintings and sculpture, fine arts. More on this building later. It had a rather lengthy history. Even while work was going on, they're trying to figure out how to turn a profit on the fair. They built a board fence over a mile long that surrounded the fairgrounds, and they charged 25 cents for people to come inside, watch the fair while it was under construction. No real exhibits yet, but just to watch. Now, I keep coming back to what things cost. Is going, 25 cents doesn't sound so bad. 25 cents, which was like the standard admission all over the fair, equals $7.50 today. So you take the family to the fair, want to go see it under construction? Mom and a couple of kids, that's 30 bucks out of your pocket. It racked up pretty fast. World's Fairs are famous for that. When the fair was ready to go, they missed the grand opening. Grand opening was supposed to be January 1st, 1894. That was the big promo date. Reality kicked in. It took longer to build everything. Among other things that had to be built, along with the 120 buildings, you had to put all the utility systems in. There's nothing in the park. I mean, there's no Sunset District yet. The Richmond District is barely started. They had to install electrical lighting systems. They had to install power plants, boilers, distribution systems, fresh water, sanitation. Also, too, everything had to come cross country. The exhibits, many of the buildings that were disassembled, reassembled out here, they had to come by train. All the performers had to come by train. In fact, they had to build a train line. For those of you who know San Francisco at all, the nearest siding to the train location was near Lake Merced. They had to build a spur train line that crossed Lake Merced and then ran along the Great Highway and then up Lincoln Avenue to the fair site, to the 9th Avenue entrance to the park. And it happened so fast, it's understandable they missed the grand opening by a couple of days. So January 27th, 1894, the fair opens, and it's a hit from the start. 7,000 people show up the very first day. In this view here, and I'm going to take a second to a change here. There were so many photos taken of the fair, but of course they're all in black and white. But we are lucky in that it was the height of colored gravure era, and we can get a really good idea of the appearance of the fair from vast assortment of color gravure images and photos and postcards that were left behind. The center of the fair was the Grand Concourse, and it was dominated by what was called Bonnet's Electric Tower, 270 feet tall. It was a miniature, if you will, of the Eiffel Tower. It wasn't a slavish replica of it, but I guess big steel and iron towers were important fixtures if you have a fair. At the very top of it, there was a searchlight, a little more on that later, and there were observation decks at various levels. This was a concession. The fair was loaded with concessions. Like I said, every time you turned around, it's a quarter here, a quarter there, it was a quarter to rise the elevator to the first floor of the Bonnet Tower, a quarter to go to the next level, and so on and so on. We're looking west, and if you know Golden Gate Park at all, if you look west, today you'd be looking towards the band shell. On the right would be the De Young Museum, and on the left, the Academy of Sciences. The music concourse was the grand concourse during the fair. It was surrounded by these huge, albeit temporary buildings, and they were the most incredible mishmash of architectural styles that you could bring together. Whereas in Chicago, they'd gone very heavy with neoclassical. Everything was, painted white. Here, they wanted it to reflect the diversity of the Pacific and the world. And the building's architecture, in this case, what they call the Mechanical Arts Building, it was a mixture of, people called it Arabian Nights. You got Byzantine, you got some Gothic element details going in there. The colors, that's one thing about old black and white photos. Unless someone has taken the time to research and colorize it, you don't see colors like this that came through. The idea was supposed to be eye-popping. Oh, by the way, it was a Mechanical Arts Building. That's where you went inside and they had giant steam engines. It was the power plant for the fair. They had mining exhibitions, large steel and iron things grinding and making noise and hissing steam. Things that would impress your average visitor with the power of American mechanical know-how. Across from it, the horticulture building. Every World's Fair has a horticulture building. That's where you have exhibits of, remember, it's California. It's the middle of winter. This is where they played up the bounty of California's harvest. Oranges. There were oranges in every exhibit. Flowers, cacti, walnuts, giant butter sculptures that I guess had to be refrigerated every night and then brought out for display. In the manufacturer's building, couldn't find a good color one of this, my apologies. This was the biggest building in California when it was built. It was over 400 feet long and 200 and something feet wide. It's big as a city block. Again, there's your sort of Moorish architecture, except this one even has like a colonnade that's reminiscent of the California missions. It's sort of like a bunch of architects got together, shared a bottle of whiskey and threw their favorite design elements into a single structure. It was curious to me why they called this the biggest building in California, because Sutro Baths measured bigger. And then it dawned on me one day, it's because Sutro Baths hadn't been built yet. In 1894, it was still under construction. This was the biggest building in the West. Again, part of the reason that you're holding a fair here is you want to show off to the world that, hey, we're civilized out here. We're no longer that Wild West city of the gold rush and all that. Although there were hints of the gold rush, more of that to come. What happened if you went inside one of these buildings? They were remarkably unfinished. Open trusses, framing on the walls was visible, and the exhibitry wasn't really fancy. Good simile would be if you were to go into a giant trade exhibit, like at the Moscone Center today, and there's a bazillion cubicles, and they're showing off all the wares, and they're showing off, electronics, or they're showing off software, or they're showing off the latest razor gizmos. That's really what this was. although there were, in Chicago, there had been big pavilions from Germany and France and all that, what made it out to San Francisco were essentially small exhibits where they crammed all the manufactured goods in that had, I guess, a small fraction of what had been on display in Chicago. So here you have Austria, Germany. There were sections for Frenchware, all the different European countries. Here's an example of High Victoriana, an elephant made of walnuts with ever-present orange detailing from Los Angeles. Thank you very much. Now, the big exhibit halls, those were free to go in. Once inside, though, there were plenty of opportunity to spend 25 cents for a meal here or 25 cents for a stein of beer somewhere else. The Fine Arts Museum, this is the one we saw under construction. For some reason, this architect decided he'd go whole hog the other direction and used classic Egyptian detailing. Inside, it was a display of hundreds and hundreds of works of art, mostly by California and Western artists. Over 50% of the artists, surprisingly for the time period, were women artists. And in this particular picture, this is the inside one of the halls. Draw your attention, dead center, what looks like a giant vase. It's a giant vase. It's a giant cloisonne vase. This was the largest of three. There were two others behind it. A lot of these artworks, including those vases, these were purchased when the fair closed by Michael de Young, because this building, I said it was the only permanent building that was constructed. He envisioned, and he was right, this would become the city's first formal museum. And he purchased a lot of these artworks, and they became the core collection for what eventually became the M.H. de Young Memorial Museum. It started out in the Fine Arts Building, this ironically designed Egyptian palace. The Bonnet Tower attracted a lot of attention. He was dead center in the fair, and the guy built it as a concession. He didn't quite have it finished by the time the fair began. Pictures taken of opening day of the fair show the thing only about 2/3 finished. The upper platforms aren't there. At the very top, there was a searchlight, a 3 million candle power searchlight. He got it open by February, and as I mentioned, it was like 25 cents to the first level, and there was a cafe, the Bella Vista Cafe, on the first level, and then the second level, and then a third level. The searchlight wasn't accessible to the public, but from the top, we'll put it this way, it was taller than the current observation tower is at the modern de Young Museum. So you had, and before the trees grew up in Golden Gate Park, it was just an astounding exhibit. And the searchlight on top, that would be lit at night. And in this case, they're shining its beam to the top of Strawberry Hill, where there used to be a building at the top of Strawberry Hill, only about a mile distant. It must have just illuminated it to the point of being blinding. They said that the 3 million candle power beam of light could be seen miles out to sea, confusing mariners who couldn't tell if it was one of the official lighthouses or what in God's name it was. It was pointed out by the Chronicle that you could actually read a newspaper at the corner of 3rd and Market by the light from this single searchlight. And of course, the corner of 3rd and Market just happens to be where de Young's Chronicle building was located, so it makes sense. That's why they chose that as the point of reference. And it's outlined in lights. Would have been easy enough just to have outlined it in lights. Would have been impressive enough in the 1890s. But these were programmed by a technology I'm not familiar with, that they operated in patterns. The lights would come on in sequence. They would ripple from top to bottom, sort of like an 1890s version of the LED lights that are now on the Bay Bridge. And it was very expensive. There were thousands of lights on this bulb, on this tower. Each one of them cost about $1. And again, that's light bulb translates to $30 in today's money a piece. So Mr. Bonet put some serious money into this. Architecture just was, I think, term bizarre comes to mind. The building on the right, that was the administration building. And here you've got Moorish influences, and you've got almost like French cake. On the left is the allegorical fountain. It's an allegory about California, and you can just keep staring at photos of this thing. It's topped by the goddess of liberty, and around the base you got women with cornucopias on their head. You got a wine press with cherubs. You got sea lions. I see cactus. I see an American eagle rampant, a grizzly bear. It just went on and on. And again, all of this stuff, it's built to last 6 months. There's also what was called the Midway Plaisance. The Midway Plaisance was essentially a midway with rides and attractions. Midway Plaisance was the name that was given to the midway where all these attractions were located in Chicago. And I guess it was midway along the fairgrounds. The name just came over here. And this is a good example of what was behind all the big industrial buildings and exhibit halls. These were your 25-cent attractions. A Colorado gold mine, which was a mock but operating gold mine with the processing and ore cars to ride. They had a miniature roller coaster. It was called a scenic railway. They had a small version of a Ferris wheel. And this is the entrance to Dante's Inferno, nice and melodramatic. As you entered, you went through a series of three-dimensional dioramas that showed the Dante's 7 layers of hell. In the background, the first wheel. And maybe we should talk about the first wheel. Why don't I say Ferris wheel? Because this is in Chicago, this photograph. This is the Ferris wheel. It was huge, 264 feet in diameter. And each one of the cars is about the size of a streetcar. They really wanted this to come out to San Francisco. Mr. Firth, or rather Mr. Ferris, who owned it, not only wasn't interested in disassembling it and sending it cross country to the West Coast, the name was patented. Mr. Ferris owned the name Ferris wheel. So the Midwinter Fair folks got a guy by the name of Firth to build you can't patent a wheel, but you can patent a name. So Mr. Firth built a round wheel called the Firth wheel. And you can just tell by the scale that the little carts here, they're about the size of like one of those portable sheds, the Tuffy shed that you buy at Sears Roebuck. And it's only 100 feet tall. But hey, it was bigger than just about anything except Bonet's Tower at the fair. Just like any World's Fair, a lot of free entertainment every day. There were band concerts. Every day had a different theme to it. You would have had like the Red Cross Day, and you would have had the Daughters of the Golden West Day. In this case, free entertainment was overhead. A guy doing a terrifying open-air balancing act. He's going to actually maneuver that ball down the corkscrew to your left, and then by all reports, he went back up. Legs of steel. And the fair had its I don't want to say seamier side, but there was like an edge to it. A lot of World's Fairs have edges to them. These two young women were called gum girls because what they did, they sold gum. I guess gum was a big seller in those days, but they ran around the fair, usually in pairs, selling gum and frankly, flirting. And that's one reason they operated in pairs. They were, for the time, they were considered to be scandalously dressed with the skirts, many inches above their ankles. they would flirt to the point where sometimes guys would get too fresh. And that's why in pairs, one girl would try to, peel the guy away, distract him. In one case, one of these girls, I think it might be the one on the right, named Iris, she actually, punched a guy out and broke his nose. So you did not mess around with the gum girls. County exhibits. Most counties in California either had their own exhibits. This is the Alameda County building. And inside you would have had exhibits of what you turned out in Alameda County. Exhibits about industries in the county, the wonderful climate in Alameda County. You always played up the bountifulness of your county or of your state or of your country in these exhibits. I love this one. This is Santa Barbara. For some reason they went Egyptian. And inside, it makes no sense, but inside it was full of marine exhibits, tanks with fish, because that's what Santa Barbara was famous for. Maybe they got a deal on the pyramid. And you had ethnic exhibit areas too. This was a German village. It was the Heidelberg Castle. It wasn't where the German government had exhibits. This was a concession. San Francisco had a huge German community at the time. And the fellow at the Heidelberg Castle figured, let's give him some good old-fashioned German entertainment with oompa music and German food and beer and women and dirndls. And it was one of those exhibits that didn't quite make it. When I first saw this photo, I knew it was supposed to be a replica of a German castle, and I thought, isn't that interesting? They've shown the castle as if it was still under construction. No, this is taken during the fair. They never finished it. People, maybe there were enough German people that didn't want to go home. It didn't attract the crowds that they thought it would, and finished the fair without ever reaching completion. I like this photo because if you look in the foreground, you can see the maze of railroad tracks. Point of reference, this building is located where the botanical gardens are today. So if you were to look to your left, past where that little horse-drawn wagon is, you'd be looking at the 9th Avenue entrance to Golden Gate Park. There was a large area that was called the Oriental Village. They didn't mean Oriental in the way of Asia. Orient in those days referred to the Near East. It was a mishmash of Moorish, Turkish, Egyptian, all on this one street called the Cairo Street. A lot of guys dressed in fezzes with his, I love the description, fierce mustaches. Women dressed as belly dancers. They had camel rides. You could, they laughed at you. You could go there and pretend to have your pocket picked. Of course, from what I've read, you could really get your pocket picked with no problem whatsoever. This was a taste of a bizarre thing of the late 19th century, which was these ethnic exhibits of people from other countries supposedly carrying out their everyday lives, almost like human beings on display. This was the Cairo street scene was populated with people who there was many of them were from the Mideast. They were hired to come. They were hired to come and drink coffee and play checkers, and offer different rides on camels. It was a concession, but it was what they considered to be a glimpse. Remember, in the 19th century, people didn't travel. No, hardly anybody would have been to Europe unless you were an immigrant who came from there. Very few people would have ever gotten to the Mideast unless they'd made a trace maybe to the Holy Land or something. And there were several exhibits like this where people were on display. A group of, it's the Esquimalt village, Inuit people from Labrador. They dug themselves a little lake and paddled around dressed in furs and in sealskin boats. The background, they look like Hostess snowballs from my youth, those little weird coconut covered things you used to get for lunch. And those are the plaster igloos in which these people lived. They actually lived on site in the village. It's not like they went, to a hotel at night, took off the oil skins and said, that was a long day. No, they spent the night in those things. You had an Inuit village. You had, not too far away, you had the Japanese village. This too was a concession, although this one was considered to be probably the most authentic of the ethnic villages, because it was put together by a fellow who lived in the Richmond district named George Marsh, who was quite knowledgeable about Japanese culture. He traveled extensively, Japanese architecture, Japanese landscaping, and he brought in authentic pieces. But it was people on display, women in kimonos. They had taiko drum exhibits, and they actually, it was such a popular attraction in the fair that the Japanese village was retained. And it's now, of course, the Japanese tea garden. And it was controversial too, not because of the people that were working there, the Asians, but this particular concession, the rickshaw ride. Japanese living in the United States were aghast at the idea of Japanese people pulling rickshaws with white people in them. One Japanese local newspaper said, it's okay in Japan for Japanese people to pull rickshaws filled with Japanese people, but for a Japanese person to haul around a white person, it would be an affront to Japan and to the emperor himself. So George Marsh solved the problem by hiring Germans instead of Japanese to pull the rickshaws, dressed them up in Japanese garb, darkened their skin, and that's how you solved the problem in the 1890s. Hawaiian exhibit, a group of folks, not sure what island they came from, could have been a series of them, living in your mandatory grass shack, everything very stereotyped. This is how people had read and heard about these foreign cultures. So you're playing to the crowd. You have an exhibit of Kilauea volcano, probably a giant paper mache volcano that erupted periodically. You had outrigger canoes, again, in a little man-made lake. And one of the most controversial was an exhibit of the Dahomey people. The Dahomey came from the Congo and from what's now Benin. There were 67 of these folks, and they constructed thatched roof huts. They lived over in the shadow of what's now Stowe Lake in Dahomey Village. They had been a huge hit at the Chicago Fair, and it was really critical, DeYoung felt, to bring them out here to the San Francisco, to the Midwinter Fair. Fortunately, what you had was people coming and seeing these folks not as a warrior tribe that were fighting for their independence. They saw them as bare-breasted women and guys with lion's teeth. And it was, we'll put it this way, Frederick Douglass, who visited the fair, he was aghast that Africans should be portrayed this way as savages and Americans paying money to look at them. At the same time, he applauded them for bringing some traditional arts, music especially, and exposing Westerners to their culture. And this isn't, I should also say that we had our own people on display, our own Californians, in what was called the 49er Village. The 49er Village was a weird, almost like Disneyland type of thing with eerie reminiscence for the wonderful days gone by of the California Gold Rush. Remember, it's only 45 years after the Gold Rush, and everyone's going, oh, it was so wonderful, and let's ride that old stagecoach and go get, drunk and play in a saloon and maybe fight off Indians. The time frame, we're still very young in California history. 45 years would be like us longing for the wonderful old days of 1975. Again, people on display. Part of it, especially with the non-Europeans, it was a racist, Eurocentric view of the world. I'm kind of torn though, because the folks, the Doheny, the folks that came, there were Native Americans from Arizona that came up. These folks were paid contractors. They may have been living in plaster igloos, but they were being paid a salary, and it was their choice. And it was I hate to judge a different time period, but in fact, there was concern about the conditions that the folks were living in while they were at the fair. But it was pointed out that they could, and some did, leave at any point that they wanted to. To use a simile today that maybe is a little bit uncomfortable, if you've ever been to the island of Oahu, there's a place called the Polynesian Cultural Center, where you pay your money to go in and you see a bunch of people from, Samoa or New Zealand or Tahiti, dressed in their native garb, and they're making tapa cloth and they're pounding poi. Is there a difference between contemporary cultural exhibits like that and what was happening in the 1890s? Fair continued on up through June until finally July 4th, last day of operation. It seems like, why have a closing date? Well, sometimes you just need to say there's going to be an end, because it builds anticipation. You build the number of visitors who are coming to your site. If they know, hey, we've only got another month or another 3 weeks or 2 more days to go see the Midwinter Fair, or the fair in the park, or the nickname, I used it once before, the Sunset City, before it closes down. It finally did on July 4th, and they started to disassemble the park, rather disassemble the fair, and again, charge you 25 cents to come inside just to watch everything being dismantled. They were going to squeeze every nickel out of everybody they possibly could. And amazingly, the fair turned a profit. It turned a profit of $66,852. I have this stuff written down. I don't memorize this. And that comes to about $2 million in today's money. That's not too bad. Now, that doesn't say how places like Heidelberg Castle that never reached completion, how the individual concessionaires did. But the fair as a whole, it made money. It did good. The promise to John McLaren was that the park would be totally restored to its pre-fair condition. And most of the buildings came down slowly, but they came down. They were salvaged. They did leave behind, I said, the Fine Arts Museum and the Japanese Tea Garden. And the Bonet Tower, through 1894 it was there. Through 1895 it was there. And into 1896, Mr. Bonet, he never took the tower down. He just walked away from it. And the Board of Commissioners for the fair, they didn't want to have anything to do with Bonet's tower. So finally, John McLaren got a team of guys to come out there, and they blew the sticks out of it and collapsed the thing into the music concourse. From what I've read, it wasn't well planned out. Pieces of the Bonet tower were blown through the skylights of the museum building in the background while people were inside. But hey, the tower was finally gone in January of 1896, 2 years after it was built. Today, gradually, the area that had been the fair, it became the music concourse. In this photograph, taken about 1925, you can see there's your old exhibit from the 1894 fair at Wright, the old Fine Arts building. That became the city's first museum, and they called it the Memorial Museum. And eventually they expanded outwards from right to left. And this was funded by Mr. DeYoung. Well, he had deep pockets. To the left, it became the new DeYoung Museum. And there was that section with the colonnade behind the palm trees that was built first, 1920. Then in 1925, the section with the tower, which some of you might remember, it had to be torn down after the Loma Prieta. And on the far left, another exhibit hall. So it was quite a complex. The trees planted in the center, all carefully topped so that you maintain that view over the music concourse. Now, the fair was gone, but if you know where to look, there are traces of the fair that are still there. You can start by looking at the benches in the music concourse. If you look closely, stamped into the cast iron seat back for your ubiquitous green Golden Gate Park bench, it says 1894 Midwinter Fair. The historian for Golden Gate Park figures that these cast iron frames are all original. He can't find any indication of anyone replicating them, and why would you to begin with? They were made out of cast iron. Cast iron doesn't really rust, not like steel, except for replacing the wood. No reason why these benches, 126 years later, couldn't still be in use. Maybe the biggest trace remain of the fair is the music concourse itself. In this map view, looking straight down, I've outlined the locations of today's DeYoung Museum at top, Academy of Sciences at the bottom, and the music band shell. You can still see the oval shape of the original grand concourse, the sunken concourse in the 1894 fair. The building that never had anything built in its place was the Industrial and Arts Museum that was the biggest building of its size at the time. That's up there in the upper right-hand corner. Otherwise, these buildings occupy footprints from the 1894 fair. Look at these little nondescript bollards in the lower foreground next to the benches. This funny little concrete things. They were simply to keep carriages and pedestrians from wandering off the street and falling down into the sunken concourse. Well, they survived. They survived through the Second World War when the anchor chains were removed between them. They survived till the 1990s and early 2000s when the music concourse was rebuilt with an underground garage. A lot of them were replicated, though. And if you go to the park and you look closely today, there's an original one on the left, and on the right, the modern version. Did a pretty good job. I think they made them slightly different on purpose so that if you're a rivet counter nerd like me, you can look at them and tell the difference in a heartbeat. And of course, George Marsh's Japanese Village, retained after the fair. The only major structure still surviving is the main entrance gate. Still there. Talking again to the historians in Golden Gate Park, it's been rebuilt many times, but it's still considered to be the same structure. Inside, the landscaping of the park has changed. At some point, the name Japanese Village dropped out in favor of Japanese Garden and then Japanese Tea Garden. And during World War II, if you read about the history of the park, the family that lived on site, the Hagiwaras and who maintained the gardens, they were interred. And in a period of post-Pearl Harbor racism, the Japanese Tea Garden was renamed the Oriental Tea Garden. The name was finally returned after the end of the war. Love this fixture. This is the Doré vase. This was an exhibit at the park. It was like the world's most ornate, largest bronze urn. Cost 25 cents to go in and see it. I did determine this lost money hand over fist. It had been in Chicago. It came out to San Francisco. They couldn't afford to bring it back to France, so Mr. DeYoung bought it, made it part of the DeYoung Museum, where it still is. So in the next photo, you see, for many years, it was displayed right outside the entrance to that fantastical Egyptian building that housed the original museum for the city of San Francisco, the old DeYoung, and it was flanked by a couple of sphinxes. When the new DeYoung was built, the Doré vase, as it's called, it was returned to its original location, even though the building was gone. That's where it sits today. And the Sphinxes, updated versions of the ones that were there during the 1890s fair. Those turns out, were made out of cast plaster and didn't last. These 1907 Sphinxes, still a landmark. Those went in. Arthur Putnam, the artist, designed these. This is 1907 vintage. Another survivor from the fair. This is called the cider press. Everybody wants to call it a wine press. It's not a wine press. It's a cider press. And if you look carefully, there's apples around the base of it, not grapes. And here it is, right in front of the Industries and Manufacturers building. Another relic, people don't think of it very much, is a prayer book cross, sometimes called Drake's Cross, just near Crossover Drive in Golden Gate Park. This is the only thing that was actually finished and dedicated on January 1st, 1894, the proposed opening date for the fair. Yeah, it was dedicated that day. But it would be 3 more weeks before the rest of the fair opened. Almost impossible to see today because it's totally enveloped with trees, but it was put on a high promontory in the park so that it would be visible to ships coming in from sea. Other vestiges that are still around. In the industrial building, they had several statues on display, statues that were going to be incorporated into a grand monument in front of City Hall in San Francisco. And this grouping of miners did end up being installed on what's called the Pioneer Monument, which after being moved when the new library was built, ended up on Fulton Street in between the Asian Arts Museum and the new main library. Very controversial statue, because one grouping in that statue included Native Americans and vaqueros and a Catholic priest. And after years and years of controversy, it was finally removed from exhibit, a foreshadowing of maybe what we're going through now. Not everything that was at that fair was considered to be politically correct by today's standards, and reflected a time and a lot of values that maybe we are re-examining painfully. An odd vestige that turned up in an unexpected place was there's that big cloisonne urn, and it was an important part of the collection of the de Young in the early days. Well, it turned up in Spenger's Fish Grotto in Berkeley when they were closing Spenger's 2 years ago. Somebody did a little research on the history of this thing and realized it had come from de Young, and before that, the 1894 fair, and before that, Chicago. No one is sure exactly how Spenger got his hands on it, but there are sort of some missing pages from the history of the de Young Museum in the 1940s and 50s, and it's very possible that the days before museums were more accountable for their collections, this may have simply been sold off. And I like this one, the Little Shamrock. It's on Lincoln Boulevard, just a little west of 9th Avenue. It opened in 1893, a year before the fair. It catered to the army of workers who were building the fair. Still there today. And we are 120 years old, reads the banner. The only official memorial to the fair is the statue that this was actually displayed in the Fine Arts Building, King Leonidas of Greece, and the statue of him was purchased by de Young, seems like everything was, as a permanent monument to the just finished fair. And the plaque on the front says, "This is the spot where the first," and that groundbreaking in August 1893. The blue dot marks Leonidas. As time went by, after the fair ended, more statues started to pop up. around the perimeter of the music concourse. And you have statues today that represent a multitude of, quote, heroic people from different time periods, ranging from Goethe and Schiller and Giuseppe Verdi. You have Miguel Cervantes. A lot of these were gifts by the different ethnic communities in San Francisco to the park, whether the park wanted them, especially Gardner, John McLaren, whether they were wanted gifts or not, they were gifts. And they tended to be put around the music concourse as memorials. And some of these memorials, I've been asked to talk about this. I usually don't include this in my talks, but some of these statues had become controversial over the years, controversial as differing groups looked at history in different ways. History was re-examined, it was debated, it was argued, and some of these statues were considered and evaluated many years ago to be, I'll say, controversial, and the Arts Commission said that they should be considered for removal. Over a decade of debate went on until one night in June of this year, when a mob took history into its own hands and pulled down Father Serra. Next to him, Francis Scott Key Memorial. I will not get into debate the method by which these came down, but it's now part of San Francisco's history that these statues, raised at one time, were brought down at another time. And I think we're in the midst of a period that we will be remembering and debating for a very long time, especially the history of the park. We also know that that night, June 19th, 2020, things got out of hand. And after these two statues came down, the next two that were on the list were nearby statues, U.S. Grant and also Miguel Cervantes. Those two were, Grant was pulled down, Cervantes was spray painted. And I will use a quote here from John King, the architect and art critic for the Chronicle. He said it was a night of adrenaline-fueled vandalism. Some of the statues, like Cervantes here, cleaned up, graffiti removed. The main statues themselves, it's now in the hands of the Art Commission. Will they be repaired? Will they go back up? Will they be displayed somewhere else? Will Francis Scott Key ever see the light of day again? Will Father Serra's statue be mounted in another location? Or will they be parts of a museum collection that's only visible for researchers? All unknowns. I've been asked about the future. It's too close. It's too close to be able to answer these questions, and people at a higher pay grade than mine, thank God, are going to have to make those decisions. On a happier note, bring you back to thinking about the multicolored fair that once exhibited. It's gone. I hope you remember, especially if you go to Golden Gate Park, when you're walking around the band concourse, imagine that if you can, the buildings that were there, the whole different feeling. I'm enough of a history nerd that when I walk around San Francisco now, I see things that aren't there anymore. I don't need, virtual reality. I got it in my head. And the guys and the women at opensfhistory.org, fantastic. If you ever get a chance, go to their website. We've got 50,000 historic photos online, hundreds of them of this fair and every other corner of the city you can possibly imagine. I want to thank you for inviting me to talk to you tonight. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. How do I give it back to you?
Oh, well, you can just stay there with that there. It's fine. Well, thank you so much, John. I so appreciate this talk. I'm going to see if I can't come back to here. Let's see. So I do have a couple questions, but thank you so much. Again, what an amazing presentation. It's like I'll never look at San Francisco, Golden Gate Park the same again. And so we do have a few questions for you. Let me just see here. I just want to. So our first question I have is from Ken Ruther, and he says, where were the buildings located around the music concourse? I think you did show a slide of that.
Yeah, I did. I can pull that back up, or if you want to, if there's a way we could post it, I can put a map up of what the fair was and show the overlay where buildings are today.
That sounds great. That sounds wonderful. Let's see, we have, is the Egyptian, let me get into the chat so I can have the question asked properly. Also, I just want to say to people, if people are jumping off right now, some are leaving, that thank you so much for being here from the Tour Guide Guild. We're happy to have you on here with our free presentation. And if you're so inclined and you'd like to share your appreciation to John Martini, his PayPal address is in the chat. I put it in there, and I'll just put it right back in there now. And if you'd like to please send him a gratuity as if you're on tour, right there on the PayPal account.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so let me get up here, John, and so were the people who occupied the foreign villages the same people who occupied, this is from Albert Walovich, were the people who occupied the foreign villages the same people who occupied the villages of the Colombian Expo?
Yes and no. They seem to have hired locally for some of the people in especially the Oriental Village, and the opening day of the fair, in fact, the Doheny, they were still on a train trying to get here from Chicago, so they went down to a vaudeville troupe, and they hired them and got them to dress up in what they thought was African-looking garb for the grand opening parade. I would say that there was not 100% accuracy in those exhibits. Got it.
This is from Allison. Is the Egyptian theme related to the, I'm going to say this right, Rosicrucianism, or just the general English vogue for Egyptology?
I think the latter. Yeah, I think there was it was the time when excavations were going on in Egypt. There was a interest growing in learning about ancient civilizations. People were going on the grand tour. The modern Egyptians were selling off their heritage to European collectors. So I think it was more a reflection of that than the Rosicrucians.
Great. This is from Sunny Legardo. How about the Wild West show with the buffalo?
There were some buffalo in Golden Gate Park, but as far as I know, they were always in a paddock. I don't think they were part of the performances or any of the exhibits in the Wild West show. But let me look into that for Sunny. I'll see. But you don't mess around with buffalo, because the buffalo paddock was way the other side of the exhibit area from where the 49er camp was. Yeah, if you know Golden Gate Park, if you know where the Pioneer Mother statue is and the old log cabin, that's the general area where the 49er camp was.
Oh, that's really cool to know. I was just up there recently.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the Japanese garden is considered the inventor of the fortune cookie? That is from Virginia.
Oh, I am reaching into my memory banks here. I think they were first offered there, but I don't know if they were invented for the fair. So this is where Google comes in handy. I just don't know.
Here's another one. says, this is from Jason Cohen. John, is your feeling that Marsh, not Hagawara, should get most credit for the tea garden? I understand that there's uncertainty about that.
I give Marsh credit for establishing the tea garden and doing it as authentically as he did. But again, that was 126 years ago now. The Hagiwaras are pretty much the ones that developed the tea garden we see today. The bridges were moved, landscaping was changed. So I consider the Hagiwaras really, the ones that get the credit for our tea garden.
Let's see. This is from Susan. Who created Stowe Lake?
Who created Stowe Lake? That was created by the Park Commission as a holding site for fresh water for irrigating the park. It existed before the fair. It wasn't a feature.
Wow. How about this from Jean Dower? Was the Park Police Station built in connection with the fair?
Oh, the one up on Stanion Street? I do not know. I'd have to look that up. I believe from the architecture, it postdates the fair. I think it's 20th century.
All right, and another one from Jason Cohen. How far beyond the music concourse did the fair extend?
That map would be helpful again, but
Okay.
it was bordered on the north side by what's now Main Drive, and then it snaked along Main Drive, climbed up to the edge of Stowe Lake, followed Stowe Lake, and then sort of dropped down, cut across over through the today's Botanical Arboretum, and then along 9th Avenue, up to about, rather along Lincoln to about 7th Avenue, and then came south again. It meandered. And the young boys learned very quickly. It was sort of a innate skill to be able to climb that fence and save the 25 cents admission.
Another one is, did the earthquake affect the art museum?
Yes, it did. It suffered a lot of damage because it was basically brick with a stone veneer. And pictures taken right after the 06 earthquake show cornices peeled off and one wall let go. It was close for about a year and a half after the 06 earthquake, and it didn't reopen until late 1907.
Oh, wow. How about this? This is from Albert Walovich again. Were there official foreign government participation, or were the foreign exhibits just brought in by manufacturers?
They seem to have been brought in by manufacturers. Yeah, possibly with the blessing, possibly with some sponsorship by the official ones. But you, like I mentioned, you did not have an official French pavilion or an official German pavilion. It was mostly trade goods, manufacturers.
Let's see. If anybody has any more questions, please put them in there. I just want to make sure that I got. Let's see. This is from. How did they recruit these cultural exhibit actors or residents? Did they just take the same ones from the World's Fair, or were they copying?
Well, the only one I really know a lot about, because they're pretty well documented, the Dahomey people. There was one white guy who went and recruited. And I think he essentially said, "Hey, come on to America. Great opportunity. You don't have to do much." And he appears in some of the group portraits with them. The other exhibits, I don't know as much about. I think my understanding is there was like a core of people, especially like in the Eskimo village, the Oriental village, a core of folks, and then to flesh out or to replace anybody who'd gone back, they hired locally.
I've got a request to tell us about the women who did the butter sculptures from Ed Franklin.
Oh, there is an entire podcast about the woman that did the butter sculptures. and it's on the Western Neighborhoods program. There, the Outside Lands podcast,
I've
and
heard that one.
my good friend Nicole Meldal researched this woman butter sculptor, and she did a whole podcast on her. I don't have it at my fingertips, but it's pretty easy to find if you go to the Western Neighborhoods website. That's a really great story. Women at the fair, both artists and also the struggling women, from the gum girls to the people that were in the information booths, the ticket sellers. Yeah, it was a rugged time.
I've listened to that podcast and it's good. I'll find that and put a connection to that too.
Thank you.
Let's see. Okay, so this is a double question. Where did all the workers stay, and on all the tourists and visitors, did San Francisco have enough hotels that time?
Yes, somebody figured out that a lot of the people that came to the fair were from the West already. You didn't have folks like in St. Louis going, by gosh, let's get on that incredibly expensive transcontinental train and go see this fair in San Francisco. Its pull was more regional. And oh yeah, San Francisco had plenty of hotels, and there were electric streetcars and cable cars and steam trains running on city streets that extended to the fairgrounds. So there was plenty of transportation, both for the workers who were building and also for the people who were coming to the fair. I don't believe there were any accommodations inside the fairground itself, though.
Oh, okay. This is a question from myself, and Allison and I were talking a little bit on chat, and so it seemed like there's a little bit of a Francophileness. There's like a lot of French names that were during this World's Fair. Is that just because I like French stuff, or is that so?
Oh, French names? Like?
Yeah, it seemed like there's a lot of Francophile names in some of the buildings and stuff like that.
Oh, I can't answer to that. I think it just reflects the people that were the most active, either putting the fair together or exhibiting.
Got it. All right, I want to see some people are asking about. Someone asked if you are accepting Venmo, but we have PayPal right now, so.
I'm not that high tech yet. Yeah.
Yeah, John and I, we've been working together to get everything all tech.
She got me set up on PayPal. I owe her, a huge debt of gratitude.
Well, let's just face it. On all these Zoom calls, it's amazing that it even happens, and that it's just so lovely that we can have these great presentations during this time and have it run so seamlessly as well.
Yeah, I give you huge credit for pulling this together. You and Len are. Look how many folks we've had.
Yeah.
More than we've had on any of the walks that I've offered. It's like I said, it's a strange, brave new world, but we're learning.
Yes, it is great. I mean, I can't tell you, we'll be saving the chat, but there's plenty of thank you, some really interesting stuff. Donna Primus, from everybody, thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's see, Donna Primus had mentioned that the cider press historical photo shows a chained cup near the bucket, which was typical of public drinking fountains at that time.
Yep. Yeah. You didn't want anyone to steal the germ-infested drinking dipper that was hanging there. So you always chained it in place. Why our ancestors didn't all have terminal dysentery, I have no idea. But now it's been replaced periodically. I think the bucket gets stolen because it's bronze. But last time I was there was a bronze bucket. It had a drinking fountain attached to it.
Well, I cannot wait to go to the park and look at the benches. I can't. That was such a cool thing.
Mm-hmm. I love those little things that are still there. Oh, that's what that was.
Wow. So I just thank you. A lot of people just thanking so much, and it was just such a great talk, and talking about the different things. Also says Kilauea was a cyclorama painting in the round at the Chicago Fair. In your historical photo, it looks like a round building that Kilauea had on it.
Yeah, it's a round building. Apparently you sat around the perimeter and the volcano was in the center. I've never seen a photograph of the inside. This is the best I can tell you. Yeah, it's amazing that a lot of stuff like that came from Chicago. These little funny kiosks where you could, buy cigars or buy tickets or buy a souvenir, whatever. They dotted the Chicago fairgrounds. They all made their way out here into to California. And I can't reinforce this enough of how distant we were. There was no Panama Canal yet. You couldn't put stuff on a steamship and send it here via the Panama Canal. There were no transcontinental highways. The only way to get stuff here was by rail. So that's why they had to build a rail line all the way along what's now Great Highway to reach Golden Gate Park. So a lot of effort went into the building a World's Fair.
Wow. I want to see if I want to make sure that everybody's just had such a great, amazing photos, just so much thumbs up here. And I want to thank you, John, just from everybody that's on this presentation and the chat's going on. Len, can you save the chat for me, please?
Yes, it's already saved. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I'll read through it when we say goodbye.
Okay, and I just want to thank everybody who joined us here in the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild. If you've ever wanted to be a guide or a little guide curious and live in the Bay Area, please come be part of our community, part of our guild. We'd love to have you.
You say guide curious?
Guide curious. Are you tour guide curious? Yeah. We'd love to have you come.
I think she just froze.
Locked up, yeah.
She locked up.
She might have lost her connection. Anyhow, I'll pick up. I think she was wrapping up, and
I think so. This was fun. This was fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, John. You're a real resource for everyone in San Francisco, and now thank you nationally. We've got John Martini fans. Thanks everybody for attending today, and stay tuned. We'll have future events not only with John but some other great presenters as well. Have a great week, and let's hope everybody gets back to regular life as soon as possible.
Okay.